The sun of 1874 beat down on the Dragoon Mountains with the fury of a blacksmith's forge. Here, in the raw heart of the Arizona Territory, the world was pared down to rock and heat, and a silence so profound it felt like a pressure against the ears. Skeletal fingers of Ocotillo clawed at a brassy, cloudless sky, and the heat rising from the baked earth made the distant mesas tremble and warp, like memories refusing to hold their shape. It was a land of brutal honesty, offering a man solitude in one hand and a swift death in the other. There was no room for lies in a place like this. Nathaniel Grayson, known as Nate to the few men he had ever allowed that familiarity, fit the landscape. At 28, he was lean and hard as a strip of sun-cured jerky, his skin weathered to the color of worn leather by a sun that bleached everything it touched. The quiet in his pale blue eyes was not the calm of a peaceful man, but the watchfulness of one who had seen too much. They were old eyes in a young face, and they held the ghosts of past traumas like silt settled at the bottom of a river. He'd worn the Union blue, first in the war between the states, and then after, as a scout in the endless, ugly skirmishes against the tribes. He carried the weight of those years not as a soldier proud of his service, but as a penitent carrying a heavy stone. He wasn't haunted by the thunder of cannons or the grand, sweeping charges that men wrote about in books. His ghosts were smaller, more intimate. They were the faces of the men he'd watched die, the surprised look in their eyes as the life went out of them. They were the smell of gunpowder and blood mingling in the hot dust, a smell that could rise up out of nowhere and choke him. He had come to this wilderness seeking an emptiness vast enough to swallow the hollowness inside him. He worked a trapper's line, living a life governed by the hard, simple rhythms of survival. Up at dawn to check the snares, the careful work of skinning a fox or a lean coyote, the patient mending of his gear in the long, hot afternoons. At night, he'd sit by his small fire, a lonely sentinel under a dome of cold, indifferent stars, the silence his only companion. His cabin, tucked away in a hidden fold of the mountains, was more than a shelter. It was a sanctuary, a testament to his desire to be a ghost himself, unseen and unheard by a world he had long since ceased to trust. One afternoon, with the sun at its most punishing, Nate was tracking the big cat that had been stealing from his traps. The tracks led him high into the rocky crags, through a narrow pass he'd never explored before. It opened into a small, hidden canyon, a bowl of rock and sand that should have been empty. It was not. The first thing that hit him was the smell. It was the scent of death and scorched leather, thick and foul in the still air. He saw the smoldering remains of what had been a small encampment, a few wickiups, now just blackened frames and burned hides, and the bodies, an old man, two younger men, a woman, all slain with a savage efficiency. He moved through the carnage with the slow, deliberate steps of a man walking into a memory he did not want to revisit. This wasn't the work of soldiers. The army, for all its brutality, had a certain grim order to it. This was messier, more personal. He saw the telltale signs of scalps taken, the work of irregulars, bounty hunters, most likely. Men who hunted human beings for profit. The thought soured his stomach. A wave of nausea, thick with self-loathing, rose in his throat. These killers wore the same color skin as he did. They breathed the same air. The bitter taste in his mouth was the taste of his own kind. His first instinct, the one that had kept him alive for years, screamed at him to leave. Do not get involved. It was the first rule of his new life. He had turned his back on the world of men and their bloody affairs. He turned to go, his heart a heavy, leaden thing in his chest. That is when he heard it, a sound so faint it was almost lost in the whisper of the wind through the canyon. A moan, thin and weak, the sound of a life trying to hold on. He froze, listening. It came again, from a heap of fallen buffalo hide near the base of the canyon wall. He approached cautiously, his rifle held at the ready. He used the barrel to nudge the heavy hide aside, and there she was. A girl, no older than 19, he guessed. She was Chiricahua Apache, Her face was slack with unconsciousness, a strand of long, black hair matted with blood against her cheek. A deep gash bled sluggishly on her side, and her head was bruised and swollen. She'd been left for dead with the others. Who must have been her family? A small band, he reasoned. One of the many that had broken from the main tribes, trying to find a piece of peace away from the endless cycle of raids and reprisals. It was a peace that had been savagely denied them. Nate's mind raced. He was a white man. To her people, he was an enemy by birthright. Helping her could bring a war party down on his head. If other white men found him with her, they'd likely ask questions with a rope. The survivalist in him, the cold, pragmatic part that had seen him through the war, screamed at him to walk away, leave her. It was not his fight. He owed her nothing. He owed no one anything. But he could not move. He looked down at her face, at the vulnerability there, at the way her chest rose and fell in shallow, hitching breaths. He did not see an Apache. He did not see an enemy. He saw a human being, a young woman, hovering on the edge of death in a blood-soaked canyon. The ghosts of his past rose up, the faces of all the people he had failed to save, the comrades who had died while he lived. They stood beside him in the blistering sun, their silent judgment more powerful than any shouted command. He could not leave her to the buzzards. It was a choice he knew, even as he made it, would unravel the solitary peace he had so carefully built. He knelt, and with a grunt of effort, gathered her into his arms. The journey back to his cabin was a brutal ordeal. She was a dead weight, limp and unresponsive, and the terrain was a treacherous maze of broken rock and thorny scrub. He moved with a hunter's care, constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of riders, pausing to brush away their tracks with a pine bough. Every step was a risk, every shadow a potential threat. Back in the oppressive heat of the cabin, he laid her gently on his own narrow cot. His knowledge of medicine was the rough-and-ready sort learned on battlefields and in frontier camps, but it was all he had. He cleaned her wounds with water from his canteen. The gash on her side was deep, down to the ribs. He gritted his teeth and stitched it closed with a crude needle he fashioned from bone and a thread of sinew pulled from a deer hide. The intimacy of the act was not lost on him. His hands, which had held a rifle against her people, were now working to save one of them. He was touching the skin of an enemy, gently washing the blood and grime away, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender. For days, she was lost in the gray lands between life and death. A fever took hold, and she drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering words he could not understand in the throes of a violent delirium. In her few moments of lucidity, her dark eyes would fly open, wide with terror and confusion. They would fix on his face, and she would see not a savior, but a white man, the face of the men who had murdered her family. She would struggle weakly against him, her whispers a ragged mix of Apache words and fearful moans. Nate was patient. He spoke to her in a low, calm voice, the way he would with a spooked horse. He offered her water from a spoon, and when she was able, forced spoonfuls of thin broth between her lips. He sat by her side through the long, silent nights, the only light from the flickering fire and the distant, cold stars. He watched her breathe, a profound and unwelcome sense of responsibility settling over him like a heavy blanket. In the firelight, he studied her features, the high, proud cheekbones, the elegant line of her jaw that held a promise of strength even in her weakened state. She was beautiful, in a way that was as wild and untamed as the mountains themselves. Slowly, the fever broke. As her consciousness returned, so did her fear. But now it was a solid thing, a quiet, simmering hostility that radiated from her like heat from a rock. She refused to speak. Her dark eyes, intelligent and full of a pain he could only guess at, followed his every move with suspicion and hatred. In her mind, he was her captor, another white man with cruel intentions, biding his time. Nate understood her fear. He had seen it in the eyes of enough people to recognize it. He did not push her. He simply went about his routine, a silent dance of survival within the cabin's four walls. He left food and fresh water by her cot. He would speak to her occasionally in the broken Spanish he'd picked up in the territory, knowing that many Apache understood it. He told her his name was Nate. He told her he meant her no harm. He tried to show her, through his steady, non-threatening actions, that he was not the monster she believed him to be. He continued to run his trap lines, but he never strayed far, his concern for the silent woman in his cabin overriding his need for pelts. He found himself talking to her even when she did not answer, filling the oppressive silence with the sound of his voice. He told her about the animals, about the way the light changed on the mountains at sunset. It was more than he had spoken in years, and he felt the rust flaking off parts of himself he thought had seized up forever. The turning point came one evening without warning. A summer storm, common in those mountains, rolled in with sudden, violent fury. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled like a banshee. Then the thunder began. Great, cracking booms that sounded like cannon fire echoing through the canyons. The first clap threw Nate back in time. He was no longer in his cabin in Arizona. He was on a field in Georgia, the air thick with smoke and the screams of dying men, the ground shaking with the roar of artillery. The memories he had tried to bury in the wilderness clawed their way to the surface, raw and terrifying. He collapsed against the log wall, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead, and his body began to shake uncontrollably. Naylin had been watching him from the cot, her expression a mask of silent hostility. But as she saw him crumble, as she saw the raw agony on his face, she saw something else. She saw not a captor, not a monster, but a man drowning in his own pain, her own trauma. The fresh, gaping wound of her family's slaughter gave her an unexpected window into his torment. She saw a reflection of her own. For the first time, she saw a vulnerability in him that mirrored the brokenness in her own heart. Hesitantly, her body still weak and aching, she rose from the cot. She moved toward him slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a wounded wolf. He was lost in his own private hell, his eyes wide and unseeing. She reached out a tentative hand and placed it on his trembling shoulder. The touch was electric. The simple, human contact broke through the deafening roar of the past. Nate flinched, then blinked, the ghosts receding. He looked up, his pale blue eyes clearing, and met her dark gaze. In that moment, something shifted in the small, fire-lit cabin. The years of history, the wall of race and blood and hatred that stood between them, cracked. They were no longer just a white man and an Apache woman. They were two wounded people, adrift in a sea of pain, and for a heartbeat, they saw the same sorrow in each other's eyes. In the days that followed the storm, the atmosphere in the cabin changed. The silence was no longer heavy with suspicion, but with a quiet contemplation. One morning, as he handed her a cup of water, she spoke. Her voice was soft, hesitant from disuse, a mixture of Apache and the Spanish she had learned from her grandmother. She told him her name, Naylin. She asked him why. Why had he saved her? Nate looked at her, at the earnest question in her eyes. He could have given her 1,000 answers, 1,000 justifications. Instead, he gave her the simple truth. I could not leave you there. He did not try to speak for his race, did not try to explain away the violence that had destroyed her world. He just stated his own simple, personal fact. That honesty was a seed. It fell on the barren ground of her grief and began, impossibly, to grow. She started to see the man, not just the white face. She started to speak more, sharing small pieces of herself. He learned that her name meant gift from the sun in her people's tongue. She learned that he came from a family of farmers in a place called Ohio, a place she could not imagine, and that they were all gone now, taken by sickness years before. They were two profoundly lonely people, survivors of different wars, bound by a shared knowledge of tragedy. As Nalin's physical strength returned, a new kind of intimacy bloomed in the close confines of the cabin. She began to move about, her actions fluid and efficient. She started to help, at first in small ways, then in larger ones. She showed him how to find and prepare certain edible roots that grew near the creek, a knowledge that added a welcome variety to his meager diet of jerky and beans. He, in turn, showed her how to properly sight and fire his rifle. He was impressed by her steady hand and her sharp, unerring eye. They fell into a domestic rhythm that felt both strange and deeply comforting. The small cabin, once the symbol of Nate's deliberate isolation, became a shared space, a fragile bubble of peace in a hostile world. The harsh, beautiful landscape outside, with its constant threat and its breathtaking vistas, seemed to press in on them, reinforcing their dependence on one another. The vast emptiness that had once dwarfed Nate now seemed to bind them together, two small figures against an epic backdrop. An unspoken attraction grew between them, as quiet and powerful as the mountains themselves. It was there in the way their hands brushed when she passed him a skinning knife. It was in the way he found himself watching her as she sat by the fire in the evenings, her nimble fingers braiding her long, dark hair, the firelight catching the warm tones in her skin. It was in the way her gaze would sometimes linger on his face, on the tired lines around his eyes that spoke of a deep and abiding sadness. This growing desire was a dangerous thing, freighted with the weight of their two worlds. For Nate, to love an Apache woman felt like a betrayal of everything he had been, a violation of an unwritten but ironclad law. And yet, it also felt like the only true and honest thing he had done in a decade. For Nalin, her feelings for this ghost-faced man were a betrayal of her murdered family, a sacrilege against their memory. And yet, he was the one who had shown her kindness when her world had burned to ashes. Their hearts were a tangled web of grief and gratitude, of fear and a powerful, burgeoning desire that both electrified and terrified them. He was drawn to her resilience, a quiet, unbreakable strength he found more profound than any loud bravery he had ever witnessed in soldiers. She was drawn to his gentleness, a quality she had never expected to find in a man of his kind, a tenderness that lived alongside the deep, visible sorrow in his eyes. The unspoken love hung in the air between them, as tangible as the scent of pinewood smoke. It was a dangerous and beautiful flower, blooming in the middle of a desolate, war-torn land. They stood on the precipice of a choice, their shared glances a silent promise of a connection as inevitable as it was perilous, a connection that would surely sever them from everything they had ever known. The punishing heat of summer bled out of the high desert, replaced by the crisp, golden light of late autumn. The days grew shorter, pulling a blanket of deep, chilling cold over the mountains as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. The world outside the cabin was contracting, hunkering down for winter. And so too did the world of Nate and Nalin. The cold forced them into a closer proximity, the small hearth becoming the center of their existence. The physical closeness, the sharing of the small space against the vast and growing chill, worked like a slow solvent on the last of their emotional reservations. The unspoken thing that had grown between them in the heat now simmered in the cold, waiting for a spark. It came not as a lightning strike, but as a single, stray ember. One evening, Nalin sat on a stool by the fire, her head bent in concentration as she mended a tear in one of Nate's flannel shirts. Her movements were deft and sure, a quiet rhythm in the flickering light. Nate watched her, the simple domesticity of the scene a painful, beautiful ache in his chest. A log in the fire popped, sending a shower of orange sparks into the air. One landed on the back of her hand. She cried out, a soft, sharp sound of surprise and pain, and dropped the shirt. In an instant, Nate was by her side, kneeling on the hard-packed earth floor. "Let me see," he said, his voice rough with concern. He took her hand in his, turning it over gently to inspect the small red mark. His thumb brushed over her skin, his touch so careful, so tender. It seemed to quiet the entire world. The wind outside, the crackle of the fire, all of it fell away into a profound silence. He looked up from her hand to her face. In the warm glow of the firelight, her dark eyes were wide and luminous, and in their depths, he saw not just gratitude or pain, but a raw, unguarded reflection of the same desperate longing that was clawing its way up his own throat. The air grew thick, heavy with all the words they had never spoken. He leaned in, his movements slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to turn away, to break the spell. She did not move. Her gaze held his, and her lips parted in a soft, hitching breath. Their first kiss was hesitant, a gentle, questioning touch. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence, an acknowledgement of the fragile, impossible thing that had taken root between them in this lonely place. It was a question and an answer, a prayer and its fulfillment all in one. For both of them, it was a moment of profound emotional release, the breaking of the ultimate taboo. It was more than an act of love. It was an act of defiance, a quiet declaration of war against the two worlds that had shaped them, the two worlds that would condemn them for this single, sacred moment. That night, they became lovers. In the narrow confines of the cot, under a single threadbare blanket, they sought a comfort that went far beyond the physical. It was a raw and desperate communion of two souls who had believed themselves to be terminally lonely. For Nate, whose hands had known little but the cold steel of a rifle and the grim work of war, it was an act of redemption, to offer tenderness, to touch and be touched with a gentleness he thought had died in him, was to feel a piece of his own lost humanity return. For Nalin, whose body had been an object of violence, left for dead amongst the ruins of her life, it was an act of reclamation. She was not a victim, but a woman choosing connection, choosing life in the face of devastating loss. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the quiet dark, the real intimacy began. They began to speak, their voices low whispers against the vast silence of the mountains. They shared the stories of their scars, the ones on their skin and the deeper ones carved into their souls. Nalin spoke of her family, her voice thick with unshed tears. She painted pictures for him with her words, bringing to life the people she had lost, her mother, with her gentle hands and her songs, her father, a proud, quiet man who could read the land like a book, her younger brother, whose laughter she could still hear if she listened hard enough. She spoke of their small band, of their dream of a peaceful life away from the fighting, a dream that had ended in blood and ash. Then it was Nate's turn. He had never spoken of the war to anyone, had never given voice to the things that haunted his nights. But with her head resting on his chest, her breath warm against his skin, the words finally came. He told her about Andersonville, the Confederate prison camp in Georgia. He had not been a prisoner there, but a guard, a boy of 19 forced to watch thousands of men from his own side waste away from starvation and disease. He confessed his deepest, most corrosive shame, the numbness that had eventually set in. He described how, in order to survive the daily horror, he had been forced to shut down a part of himself, to build a wall inside his soul so that he could look upon the walking skeletons of his countrymen and feel nothing. "A man can get used to anything," he whispered into the darkness, his voice choked with a decade of guilt. "And that is the most terrible thing in the world." They were stripping themselves bare for each other, offering up their darkest tragedies as a form of sacred trust. Their love was not an escape from their pain, it was being forged within it. The horrors of their pasts were not just a backdrop to their story, they were the very foundation upon which their profound connection was being built. In the days that followed, a new understanding settled between them. They decided to marry. There was no preacher to bless their union, no family to bear witness. Apache custom was a world Nalin could no longer access, so they created their own. They walked to the small creek that trickled through the rocks near the cabin, the same creek where she had first seen a reflection of her own recovering face. They stood under the vast, open sky, the silent, watchful mountains their only congregation. Nate had spent days working a piece of silver wire he'd scavenged from a broken harness. He had hammered and polished it into a simple, unadorned ring. He took her hand and slipped it onto her finger. Nalin, in turn, pulled a small, smooth piece of turquoise from a pouch she wore around her neck. It was carved in the shape of a water bird, a talisman her father had given her for protection on the day she had come of age. She pressed it into Nate's palm. Their vows were as simple and as honest as the land around them. There were no promises of forever, no talk of love until death. In their world, such promises were a fool's luxury. They spoke instead of loyalty, of shelter, of protection for whatever time they were given. "In the eyes of this land," Nate said, his voice steady and clear, "I take you as my wife." Nalin responded in the soft, flowing words of her own tongue, then looked into his eyes and translated, "My heart will be your shelter." It was a deeply romantic and poignant moment, their private sacrament a rebellion against a world that saw them only as enemies. In that small clearing, by that trickling creek, they had created their own nation, a population of two, with its own laws and its own blessings. Their life together settled into a new domesticity, one colored by the quiet confidence of their love. There were moments of simple, profound joy that felt like stolen treasures. Nate had an old, worn Bible, the only book he owned. He would sound out the words for her, and she would watch his finger trace the letters. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she learned to read her first few words of English. In return, she taught him the names of the stars in her language, pointing out the patterns her people saw in the night sky, telling him the stories of the great hunter and the celestial coyote. They began to hunt together, moving through the wilderness with a silent, synchronized grace. He was a skilled marksman, with an eye that never wavered. She was a master tracker, able to read the faintest signs on the forest floor. They were a formidable team, their combined skills making them more successful survivors than either had ever been alone. These moments were glimmers of hope, the suggestion of a possible life built not on the ashes of their pasts, but on a foundation of mutual respect and shared strength. But the outside world was a hungry wolf, always circling, and their idyllic isolation was as fragile as a desert flower. Their supplies of salt, coffee, and flour were running low. Nate knew he would have to make the 2-day ride to the nearest settlement, a rough-and-tumble mining camp called Purgatory Flats. He had not been there in almost a year, and he dreaded the thought of it. But necessity left him no choice. Purgatory Flats was a scar on the face of the landscape, a chaotic collection of tents, clapboard shacks, and saloons, all clinging to the side of a dusty hill. The air was thick with the smells of sweat, whiskey, and raw greed. As Nate tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, he could feel the eyes on him. He was a stranger, and in a place like this, a stranger was either a threat or a mark. The air inside the store was even fouler, thick with the anti-Apache sentiment that had been boiling over in the territory, fueled by recent raids and the sensationalized stories that filled the eastern newspapers. He gathered his supplies, keeping his head down, his face a neutral mask, but he could not block out the conversation coming from a group of hard-looking men gathered around the pot-bellied stove. They were loud, their voices full of a bragging cruelty that made Nate's skin crawl. He recognized their type instantly. Men who lived by the gun and for the dollar, their souls as barren as the land they plundered. Their leader was a tall, calculating man with a thin, cruel mouth and dead eyes. Nate heard another man call him Silas Kane. They were talking about a recent job, bragging about the slaughter of a small band of Chiricahua in the Dragoons. They described the attack in graphic, stomach-turning detail, laughing as they spoke of the people they had killed as if they were no more than animals. Nate stood frozen by the counter, his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles were white. A storm of pure, cold hatred raged inside him, but he forced his face to remain impassive. To react would be to die. Then the conversation shifted, and Nate's blood ran cold. Silas Kane mentioned that one had gotten away. A young woman. He said they'd found her tracks leading out of the canyon, but had lost them in the rocks. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Does not matter," Kane said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the hot stove. "I put the word out, $50 in gold for her scalp. Someone will find her." Nate paid for his supplies, his movements stiff and automatic. He walked out of the store and into the blinding sunlight, his heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Their sanctuary was not a sanctuary, it was a prison, and they were being hunted. He rode back to the cabin with a desperate urgency, the dread, a cold knot in his gut. He found Nolan by the creek, washing their clothes. He told her everything he had heard, his voice low and grim. The news struck her like a physical blow. Her face went pale, and her eyes filled with a familiar terror. But then, as the full weight of his words settled on her, the fear was burned away by a cold, incandescent fury. The confirmation that her gentle mother, her proud father, her laughing brother had been butchered for a handful of gold coins hardened something inside her. It was a resolve as unyielding as the mountain rock. She would not be a victim. She would not be a trophy for Silas Kane. She would survive, and her life would be a testament against their erasure. The idyllic peace of their home was shattered. They became more vigilant, their senses constantly on edge. They set up hidden warning signs on the trails leading to the cabin, a carefully placed pile of rocks, a broken branch. Nate dug pits and set snares, not for animals, but for men. Every snapped twig, every distant cry of a hawk, sent a jolt of anxiety through them. The beautiful, wild landscape that had been their refuge now felt like a cage, its vastness offering nowhere to hide. The pressure, instead of driving them apart, welded them together. They clung to each other, their shared danger an accelerant for their love. Their nights were filled not just with passion, but with whispered fears and reassurances, each a promise to the other that they would not face the darkness alone. Nate's protective instincts, honed by years as a scout, were now focused entirely on her. The thought of losing her, of seeing her harmed by men like Silas Kane, was more terrifying than any battlefield he had ever faced. Naylin, in turn, found herself consumed with worry for him. She knew that his choice to save her had put a target on his back from both sides. Their love story had become a survival story, and each new day they woke together was a hard-won victory. Their isolation was broken again, but not by the men they feared. It was broken from a direction they had not anticipated. For months, a small party of Chiricahua warriors had been searching, following rumors, trying to learn the fate of the small band that had disappeared. The party was led by Nolan's older brother, Cale. He was a man made hard by a lifetime of war and loss. He loved his sister fiercely, but his worldview was as rigid and unforgiving as the land itself, defined by the sharp, binary line between Apache and enemy. One morning, his sharp-eyed scouts discovered the faint signs of Nate's trap lines and began to follow them, moving with a deadly, silent purpose toward their source. Nate was in the small clearing in front of the cabin, his back to the forest as he split firewood. He had his rifle, but it was leaning against the cabin wall, just out of reach. He felt a change in the air a split second before it happened, a sudden, unnatural stillness. He started to turn, but it was too late. They were all around him, emerging from the trees like ghosts. They were silent, their faces painted for war, their dark eyes filled with a cold, implacable purpose. A tall warrior stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled fury, a face Nate would soon learn belonged to Cale. He spoke in rapid, guttural Apache, his words sharp and accusing. Nolan heard the strange voice and ran from the cabin. She stopped dead at the edge of the clearing, and her face became a whirlwind of colliding emotions. Shock, a disbelieving, radiant joy, and then immediate and gut-wrenching. A cold wave of absolute fear. "Cale!" she cried out, her voice a strangled whisper. Her brother's gaze snapped to her. For a fraction of a second, the iron mask of the warrior cracked, and a look of profound relief and love softened his features. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. His eyes took in her appearance, the dress she wore, made from one of Nate's old blankets, her presence coming from the white man's dwelling. His gaze shifted from her to the bound white man, and his mind, conditioned by a lifetime of violence and betrayal, leaped to the only conclusion it could. His sister had not been saved. She had been taken. She was a captive, a prize of the enemy, and her honor had been defiled. "Seize him!" Cale snarled. Before Nate could react, two warriors grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back and binding them tightly with a strip of rawhide. Naylin rushed forward, pleading with her brother in their native tongue, the words tumbling out in a frantic, desperate torrent. She tried to explain, to tell him that Nate was not an enemy, that he had saved her life, that he was a good man. But Cale was deaf to her pleas, blinded by his own grief and a lifetime of well-earned hatred. He saw Nate not as an individual, but as a symbol of the entire ghost-faced race that had destroyed their people, their land, and now, their family. He refused to listen, believing her words were born of fear, or that her mind had been twisted by her captor. In his eyes, her desperate defense of this man was not a sign of love, but the most damning symptom of her violation. He barked an order. The warriors began to drag Nate toward the center of the clearing, their intentions as clear and as chilling as the cold autumn air. Naylin watched in horror, trapped in an impossible nightmare, caught between the brother she loved and the husband she could not live without, her fragile world about to be torn to pieces by the very people she had once called her own. The small clearing, which had been a place of quiet domesticity, transformed into a grim stage. The air, once filled with the scent of pine and the sound of an axe splitting wood, was now thick with a silent, menacing tension. Nate was shoved violently against the tall, slender pine tree that supported the roof of his lean-to, the rough bark scraping his back. Acting on Cale's sharp commands, two warriors began to bind him to the trunk with long strips of rawhide. They worked with a grim, practiced efficiency that sent a chill through Nate's bones, their movements economical and sure, the ritual of it all too familiar. He did not struggle. He knew it was useless. Any resistance would only be met with a blow from a rifle butt and would hasten the inevitable. Instead, he held himself still, his muscles tense, and locked his eyes on Cale. He tried to pour all the humanity he could into his gaze, to project a sense of calm he did not feel, a silent plea to be seen as a man, not the animal Cale believed him to be. But Cale's gaze was like flint, hard and devoid of mercy. He did not see Nathaniel Grayson. He saw only a ghost face, a faceless representative of the race that had stolen his land, slaughtered his people, and, in his mind, taken his sister's honor. Around them, the other warriors murmured in their own tongue, their faces a mixture of cold contempt and grim satisfaction. This was the old way. This was justice. Naylin was a whirlwind of frantic desperation. She pleaded with Cale, her voice cracking with an anguish that tore at Nate's heart. The words, in her native tongue, were a torrent of reason and begging. She tried to tell him the whole story, the truth of it, starting from the blood-soaked canyon where her family lay dead. She spoke of her injuries, of being left for dead, of how this man, this stranger, had found her and carried her here. She told him how he had nursed her, how he had been patient and kind, how he had protected her. "He is a good man," she cried, the Spanish words mixing with her own. "A man of honor." But her words were like stones thrown against a cliff wall. They made no impression and fell uselessly to the ground. Cale was a man consumed, hollowed out by his own grief and a lifetime of righteous rage against the white man. He could not hear her. Perhaps he would not. In his twisted logic, her passionate defense of Nate was the ultimate proof of her corruption, the final, damning evidence of his poison. "He has put lies in your head. Little sister!" he snarled. And for the first time, Nate heard the pain that laced the anger in his voice. It was the sound of a heart breaking. "The coyote pretends to be a dog, but it will always eat your chickens." He barked a sharp command, and one of the larger warriors moved to Nullin's side, grabbing her arms from behind. She struggled against him, a wild, desperate strength born of terror, her wide, dark eyes fixed on Nate, her face a mask of pleading. The last rawhide knot was pulled tight, biting into Nate's wrists and securing him fast to the tree. Cale stepped forward into the center of the clearing. With a slow, deliberate movement, he drew a long, sharp knife from the beaded sheath at his belt. The autumn sunlight caught the polished steel, sending a cruel, blinding glint across the clearing. The intent was terrifyingly clear. This was not to be a quick death. This was to be a lesson. A slow and ritualistic execution meant as a warning to all white trespassers. For Nullin, it was to be a twisted sort of purification, a cleansing by blood for her perceived dishonor. The other warriors gathered in a loose semicircle, their expressions grim and resolute. This was vengeance not just for one man's crime, but for generations of suffering. Nate watched the knife. His heart pounded a heavy, suffocating rhythm in his chest. His mind, in a flash of terrible clarity, was thrown back to the war, to other moments when death had been this close, this personal. He thought of Nullin. He thought of the brief, impossible, beautiful life they had carved out for themselves in this small cabin. A profound sadness washed over him, so immense it threatened to drown him. It was not a sadness for his own life ending, but for the pain this would cause her, for the new and terrible scar this moment would carve into her soul. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and braced himself for the first cut. It was then that Nayland screamed. It was not a sound of fear or of pleading. It was a sound torn from the very depths of her soul, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and white-hot fury. It was the sound of a world breaking. The sound was so raw, so powerful. It momentarily stunned the warriors. Even Cale froze, his hand held high, the knife glinting. In that instant of hesitation, Nayland found her strength. With a surge of adrenaline that defied her size, she ripped herself free from the warrior holding her. He stumbled back, surprised by her ferocity. She threw herself in front of Nate, spreading her arms wide, her small body a desperate shield for his. Her chest was heaving, tears streamed down her face, but her eyes burned with a defiant fire that no one, not even her brother, had ever seen before. Her voice, when she screamed again, was no longer a plea. It was a command, a declaration that rang through the silent forest and seemed to shake the very mountains. "Stop! Do not hurt him! Do not hurt my husband!" Silence. A heavy, absolute silence descended upon the clearing. The wind seemed to hold its breath. The murmuring of the warriors ceased. They stared, their faces masks of dumbfounded disbelief. Cale remained frozen, his arm still raised, but the knife in his hand seemed to tremble. The words she had screamed hung in the air, an impossible, blasphemous concept that defied all understanding. "Husband." Cale's gaze dropped from the knife to his sister's tear-streaked, defiant face. He looked at the bound white man she was shielding, and then back at her. The murderous fury in his eyes slowly, visibly, gave way to something else, something far more terrible, a profound, soul-crushing hurt. He had come here prepared to be an avenger. He had steeled himself to find his sister a victim, a casualty of the white man's lust, and he had been ready to wash away her shame with this man's blood. But he had not been prepared for this. He had not been prepared to find her a willing participant, a wife. This was a betrayal that cut far deeper than any physical violation. It was a betrayal of their blood, their traditions, their gods. It was a betrayal of the memory of their murdered family. Slowly, his arm descended. The knife hung limply at his side. His face was a mask of anguish. the face of a man whose world had just been irrevocably shattered. He spoke to Nalin, his voice low and trembling, the rage now poisoned with an unbearable sorrow. He told her she had shamed the spirits of their ancestors. He told her she had chosen the ghost face over her own people, the people who had nurtured her and loved her. He told her that by joining herself to a man whose kind had slaughtered their mother, their father, their brother, she had effectively chosen to die with them. Nalin stood her ground. She was weeping, great, silent tears that carved paths through the dust on her cheeks. But her resolve was like iron. "His kind did not slaughter our family," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Specific men did, evil men. This man saved me." She looked from her brother to the man she was protecting. "My heart chose him, and in the eyes of the spirits of this mountain, who saw our vows, he is my husband, he is my life." The chasm between them was absolute, a canyon that could never be bridged. Kale saw the world in two colors, Apache and enemy. Nalin, through her tragedy and her love, had been forced to see the infinite, painful shades of gray. Kale made his judgment. Her desperate act, her impossible declaration, had stayed his hand. He could not bring himself to kill his sister's chosen husband as she shielded him with her body. But he could not, would not, accept this union. He turned to his warriors, his face grim, and declared his verdict. The white man would be spared, but he and Nalin were to be exiled. They were cast out. She was no longer Chiricahua. She was no longer his sister. They were to leave this territory, this part of the land that belonged to the people, and they were to do it now. If they were ever seen again by his warriors, they would be killed without question, treated as the enemies they had chosen to be. Then he did the most painful thing of all. He turned his back on her. It was a gesture of finality more cutting than any knife, more brutal than any blow. It was a declaration that, to him, she no longer existed. He would not look at her again. One by one, the other warriors, men she had known since childhood, men who were her cousins, her friends, turned their backs as well. It was a silent, collective shunning that erased her from their world. Kale strode forward and, with a single, contemptuous flick of his knife, sliced through the rawhide bonds holding Nate to the tree. "Go!" he spat, the word full of venom. "Take her and be gone from this land." And with that, the warriors melted back into the trees, as silently and as suddenly as they had appeared. They left behind a silence that was heavier and more devastating than the noise of their arrival. Nate stumbled away from the tree, the feeling slowly returning to his numb wrists. The aftermath of the terror and the sudden release was a dizzying wave of nausea. But all of that was swept away as Nalin collapsed against him, her body racked with gut-wrenching sobs that seemed to tear her apart. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. She had saved his life, and in doing so, she had lost everything else. Her brother, her people, her entire identity. She was now an outsider in the truest sense of the word, belonging nowhere, to no one. Nate held her, his own heart aching with a pain so profound it was a physical weight. He murmured words of comfort against her hair, words that felt hollow and painfully inadequate in the face of her sacrifice. The wild joy of his own survival was completely eclipsed by the magnitude of what she had lost for him. He felt the crushing weight of his responsibility to her settle onto his shoulders. He was all she had now. He was her only person, her only tribe. Their love, which had been their private, hidden sanctuary, had now become the public cause of their mutual damnation. They were free, but they were also condemned. Two people set adrift in a world where every hand, white and native, was now turned against them. They knew they could not stay. Kale's threat was chillingly real, and somewhere out there, Silas Kane and his men were still hunting, with $50 in gold as their incentive. The cabin, their first and only home, was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb waiting to happen. They moved with a numb, mechanical urgency, packing what little they could carry. Nate's rifle and ammunition, a bedroll, the last of their flour and dried meat, a water skin. Naylin gathered her own few possessions, the turquoise her father had given her, a small pouch of medicinal herbs, the bone needle she used for sewing. They were the last, pathetic remnants of their past lives. As Nalin was wrapping a spare blanket, she stopped. She stood perfectly still, her back to him, her hand pressed against her lower belly. A look of dawning wonder, mixed with a new and terrible fear, crossed her face. She turned to him slowly, her dark eyes wide. "Nate," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I think I am with child." The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. A child, his child, her child. A tiny, impossible spark of joy ignited in the darkness of his heart, only to be immediately drenched by a cold wave of absolute terror. A child, a symbol of their love, a fragile glimmer of hope for a future, and a profound, terrible liability in the dangerous, nomadic existence that now awaited them. A baby's cry in the wilderness could be a death sentence. A pregnant woman could not run, could not hide easily. The stakes of their survival, already impossibly high, had just been raised to a level that was almost unbearable. They looked at each other across the small, shadowed cabin, the unspoken question hanging between them: what kind of world were they bringing a child into? But as he looked into her eyes, he saw the fear there, but he also saw something else, the same iron resolve that had faced down her brother's knife. The discovery, as terrifying as it was, also solidified their purpose. They were no longer just surviving for themselves. They were fighting for their family. Nate went to her and placed his hand over hers on her belly. He had no words. He simply nodded, a silent promise to her and to the new life she carried. Together, they took one last look at the small cabin that had been their world. Then they stepped out into the cold autumn air, turned their backs on their home, and struck out into the vast, hostile wilderness. They were fugitives, exiled from all society, with enemies on all sides, carrying the secret of a new life that was both their greatest hope and their most terrible vulnerability. Their life became a thing of shadows. They were creatures of the night, moving under the cold, indifferent light of the moon and the stars, while the days were spent in hiding, tucked away in the shallow shade of a rocky outcrop or the sparse cover of a mesquite thicket. They moved south, always south, driven by the vague and desperate hope of the Mexican border, a line on a map that they prayed might mean sanctuary. But the land itself rose up to fight them at every step. It was an antagonist of immense and terrible power. They left the broken mountains and entered the brutal, open wastes of the Sonoran Desert. The sun was a physical weight, a hammer that beat down on them from a mercilessly white sky. They traversed the alkali flats, vast, cracked plains of white earth that shimmered with a heat that could drive a man mad. There was no water here, no shade, no mercy. It was a landscape stripped bare of all but the will to endure. Their suffering was a constant, intimate companion. Their lips cracked and bled. The sun scorched their skin, leaving it tight and painful. The gnawing hunger in their bellies settled into a dull, permanent ache. A gunshot was a luxury they could not afford, a sound that would carry for miles and bring death down upon them. So they survived on the margins. Nate became skilled at killing silently, a well-aimed rock taking a sunning lizard or a coiled snake. But mostly, they survived on Naylin's knowledge. She found tough, bitter roots that she dug from the parched earth with a sharpened stick. She located the hidden seeps of water, mere damp patches of sand at the base of a rock wall that Nate would have walked past without a second glance. This shared struggle forged a new and deeper intimacy between them, one born of pure survival. There was no room for modesty or pride when one's life depended on sharing the last few precious drops of water from a skin, or when Nate had to help Naylin over a rocky patch. His hands on her body now, not as a lover, but as a brace against a fall that could mean the end. They saw each other at their most raw, their most vulnerable, gaunt with hunger, their faces caked with dust, their bodies weakening day by day. This hardship, instead of breaking them, stripped their love down to its essential, unadorned core. Romance was no longer in whispered words by a warm fire. It was in the act of Nate giving her the larger piece of roasted snake, his own hunger a secondary concern. It was in Nayland finding a certain leaf to chew that eased his thirst. It was in the silent changing of the watch in the dead of night, one collapsing into an exhausted, dreamless sleep while the other sat with the rifle, staring into the darkness, listening. Nayland's pregnancy became the central, agonizing focus of their journey. In the early months, she was plagued by waves of nausea and a bone-deep fatigue that the brutal realities of their life amplified tenfold. There was no rest for her, no proper food to quell the sickness. Every step was an effort of will, every sunrise a promise of more misery. Nate's heart broke for her, watching her suffer. He was the protector, the man who had promised to be her shelter, and yet he could do nothing to ease her pain. He could not build her a home, could not hunt her a deer, could not even offer her a full belly or a safe place to rest her head. This crushing sense of helplessness fueled a quiet, simmering rage within him. It was a cold, hard anger directed at the world, at Cale for his blind hatred, at Silas Kane for his greedy cruelty, at the faceless forces that had ground their lives down to this desperate, walking existence. The rage sharpened him. He became hyper-vigilant, his senses honed to a razor's edge by a constant, humming fear for her and for the unborn child she carried. He pushed himself to the brink of exhaustion and beyond, scouting far ahead of their path, circling back to erase their tracks, his mind constantly working, anticipating, planning, trying to stay one step ahead of the death that hunted them. Often, in the dead of night, he would watch her sleep, her face serene for a few precious hours in the pale moonlight. He would lay his hand gently on her still flat belly, and be overwhelmed by a love so fierce and so painful it felt like a physical presence in his chest. Nayland, for her part, displayed a quiet, formidable strength that left Nate in awe. Her connection to the land, once a source of cultural identity and spiritual meaning, was now the single thread from which their survival hung. She read the terrain with an instinct that felt like magic to him, her spirit unbroken by her physical misery. But her spirit was deeply wounded in other ways. The pain of her exile was a constant companion, a ghost that walked beside her. At night, she had nightmares, dreams of her brother turning his back on her again and again, of the faces of her ancestors frowning upon her in shame. She mourned the loss of her community with a silent, aching grief. She confided in Nate during their hushed conversations under the vast, star-dusted sky. She spoke of how the news of a pregnancy should be shared, how her mother and her aunts would have gathered around her, their hands on her belly, singing the old songs to welcome the new spirit into the world. She grieved for the rituals her child would never know, for the community it would never have. Nate would listen, his heart aching for her, offering the only comfort he had, his unwavering presence. He would hold her hand in the darkness and promise her that their child would know love, even if it knew no tribe, no songs, no people but them. These conversations were heavy with the weight of their tragedy, a constant reminder of the cultural void they now inhabited. Their child would be born between worlds, belonging to neither, a living, breathing symbol of both their love and their profound isolation. One sweltering afternoon, hiding in a jumble of sun-blasted rocks overlooking a wide, dusty valley, they were nearly discovered. A patrol of U.S. cavalry rode into view, a dozen men in dusty blue, their horses kicking up a plume of alkali dust. Nayland stiffened beside him, her hand gripping his arm. She recognized the man at their head, an officer with a reputation for a brutal, no-quarter policy towards all Apache. As they watched, frozen in their hiding place, the patrol fanned out and cornered a lone figure in the valley below, an Apache man, A runner from another band by the look of him. He was unarmed, and he raised his hands in a clear sign of surrender. It did not matter. From their vantage point, they witnessed the summary execution. A single, casual rifle shot. The officer did not even break stride. The casual cruelty of the act was horrifying. For Nalin, it was a visceral, sickening reminder of the world's implacable hatred for her people. For Nate, it was like looking into a distorted mirror. He saw the blue uniform he had once worn with pride, now a symbol of indiscriminate slaughter. The incident shattered any lingering, naive hope he might have harbored that they could find safety or justice among his own kind. It reinforced the terrible, absolute truth of their situation. They were utterly, completely alone. After the soldiers had passed and the dust had settled, Nalin began to tremble uncontrollably, a delayed reaction of shock and terror. Nate pulled her deeper into the shadows of the rocks and held her, and as he held her shaking body, something inside him broke. For the first time, he spoke of the specific things he had done as a scout. He confessed his own complicity in the brutal system that was now hunting them. He told her of villages burned, of tracking down families who were only trying to escape, of standing by while things were done that he knew were wrong. It was a dark, painful, ugly confession, pouring out of him like poison being lanced from a wound. But it was also an act of ultimate trust. In that moment, they were not just lovers, they were co-conspirators. Two fugitives bound together by a shared truth in a world that had no place for it. Their journey took its most devastating turn a few weeks later. They were making their way through a narrow, winding arroyo, the high rock walls offering a brief respite from the sun. But the sky, which had been a clear, searing blue, had turned a bruised, ugly gray on the horizon. The storm came upon them with a terrifying speed, a wall of black cloud that unleashed a torrent of rain. The dry arroyo filled in minutes, transforming into a raging, churning river of brown water, mud, and debris. They were separated by the current. Nate was slammed against a rock wall, a searing pain exploding in his leg, while the furious water ripped Nalin from his grasp and swept her downstream. He screamed her name, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the flood. After the water, as quickly as it had come, subsided to a manageable torrent, Nate began his frantic search. He dragged his badly injured leg through the thick, clinging mud, his eyes scanning the debris-strewn wash. He screamed her name again and again, his voice raw with a panic more absolute than anything he had ever known on any battlefield. He finally found her, washed up on a small sandbar, half buried in mud and branches. She was unconscious, her face pale and bruised. He gathered her into his arms, his injured leg protesting with every agonizing step, and carried her to a small, shallow cave he found in the arroyo wall. The cold and the physical trauma of the flood did their terrible work. That night, in the damp, chilling darkness of the cave, Nalin went into premature labor. It was a horrific, tragic scene. There was no medicine, no clean water, no help. There was only the cold rock, the sound of the dripping water, and Nate's desperate, useless prayers. He did what he could, his hands shaking, his heart a knot of terror and grief in his chest. Nalin was impossibly brave, her stoicism in the face of the agony breaking his heart into 1,000 pieces. The baby, a boy, was born too soon. He was terrifyingly small and fragile. He took a few shallow, fluttering breaths in the cold air of the cave, his tiny chest rising and falling, and then he fell silent. The loss was absolute. It was a silence that consumed everything. It was the death not just of a child, but of a future, the extinguishing of their brightest and most powerful symbol of hope. The aftermath was a study in profound, suffocating grief. Nate found a small, sheltered place at the back of the cave. He dug a shallow grave with his bare hands and gently laid their son to rest. Nalin, moving like a woman in a dream, gathered a handful of small, flat stones and arranged them over the grave in a pattern from her culture, a final, heartbreaking tie to the world she had lost. For days, they were enveloped in a silent despair. Naylin became withdrawn, her vibrant spirit seemingly extinguished. She would sit for hours at the mouth of the cave, staring out at the harsh landscape, her eyes empty and unseeing. She did not speak. She barely ate. Nate, meanwhile, was consumed by a black wave of guilt. He blamed himself. He had not kept her safe. He had brought her into this life of hardship, and it had cost them their child. The tragedy, which should have bound them together, instead created a vast chasm between them. Their shared grief was so immense, so personal, they could not reach each other across it. They were two islands of pain, floating in the same dark sea of sorrow. This was the dark night of their souls, the moment their love was tested to its absolute limit. The turning point came not from strength, but from brokenness. One evening, as they sat on opposite sides of a meager fire, the silence stretching between them like a taut, fraying rope, Nate could no longer bear it. He began to talk, his voice rough and hesitant at first. He did not talk about hope. He did not talk about the future. He spoke only of the pain. He gave voice to his grief, acknowledging his guilt, his despair, his profound love for the son he had held for only a minute. He offered no empty platitudes, no easy reassurances. He simply shared his own broken heart. "He was my son, too," he said, his voice choked with emotion, the words tearing from his throat, "and I will not forget him." His raw, honest vulnerability was the one thing that could have reached her. His words broke through the thick shell of her grief. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, then another. Her face crumpled, and she began to weep. Not quiet, gentle tears, but deep, racking sobs of a mother who has lost her child, a sound of pure, undiluted heartbreak. He went to her, crawling across the small space between them, and gathered her into his arms. He held her as she wept, his own tears mingling with hers, their shared grief finally finding a voice, in that shared catharsis. In that moment of complete and utter brokenness, they found each other again. They realized their love was not a fragile thing meant only for the good times, for the hope of a bright future. It was strong enough to endure this. It was a shelter not from the storm, but within it. Their loss did not break them. It irrevocated them. Their love became something harder, sadder, but also more profound and unbreakable. They were scarred, bereaved, and still hunted, but they had survived the ultimate tragedy. They had looked into the abyss together and had chosen, against all odds, to hold on to each other. Their journey was not over, but they would now face what was left of it not with naive hope, but with the grim, powerful resilience of those who had lost everything but each other. The character of their journey changed. The desperate, headlong flight for survival was over, replaced by a grim, hardened resolve. The open wound of grief for their son had not closed, but had scarred over, forged by the relentless sun and the cold nights into a quiet, cold anger. They were no longer just running. They were enduring. The vague hope of Mexico faded, a dream that had died in the desert. The desert had taken too much from them, and they would not give it anymore. They turned and pushed north again, away from the barren south, towards the forested mountainous regions of the Tonto Basin. The logic was that of a cornered animal seeking better ground to make a stand. The forests and canyons of the Tonto promised more game, more water, and more cover than the hell they had just walked through. It was also more dangerous, a contested land where the paths of settlers, miners, the army, and various Apache bands crossed and tangled in a bloody knot. But they were willing to trade the risk of men for the certainty of life-giving water and food. Nate's leg, which had been badly injured in the flood, healed slowly and poorly. It left him with a permanent limp, a slight drag and catch in his gait that was a constant physical reminder of the flash flood, of the terror, of the son they had lost. The limp slowed them down, but it also changed him. It forced him to be more methodical, more deliberate in his movements and his thinking. The reckless energy of his youth had been beaten out of him, replaced by the patient, calculating mind of a true survivor. Their relationship, too, had settled into a new dynamic. The shared trauma had stripped away every last artifice between them. They moved together as a single unit, their senses intertwined. A tensing in her shoulders was enough to make him reach for his rifle. A slight shift in his gaze was enough to make her scan the ridgeline. They communicated with glances, with small gestures, a language of love and survival that no one else in the world could understand. His skill with a rifle and her deep, intuitive knowledge of the wilderness made them an incredibly effective team. There were moments, brief and intensely precious, when the immense weight of their sorrow would lift. They might share a small, tired smile over a rabbit he managed to shoot for their dinner, or sit in a comfortable, profound silence on a high bluff, watching a sunset paint the canyon walls in brilliant hues of orange and purple. These moments were glimmers of the life they might have had, and they served as a desperate fuel for their continued existence. The romance was no longer in kisses and whispered words. It was in the act of Nate, his hands now sure and gentle, rewrapping the worn deerskin bandage on Nalen's battered moccasins. It was in Nalen finding a specific, bitter herb to make a tea that eased the constant, dull ache in his leg. Their love had become the relentless, daily, sacred work of keeping each other alive. Their path inevitably crossed with the world they were trying to escape. Deep in a winding box canyon, a place so remote it felt like the world's end. They found it. A small, abandoned line cabin, once used by prospectors. It was little more than a one-room shack of rough-hewn logs, but the roof was mostly intact, and the stone fireplace still drew. It was more shelter than they had known in months. They decided to stay, just for a while, to rest and regroup. This brief period of stability, of having a solid roof over their heads, allowed the true depth of their psychological wounds to surface. With the constant need for movement paused, their minds were free to wander into the dark corners of their grief. Nalen began a quiet, personal ritual of mourning. In a small, protected alcove at the back of the cabin, she built a small shrine to the son she had never had a chance to name. It was made of meaningful objects she had collected, a uniquely shaped stone from the arroyo where he was born, a single, perfect eagle feather, a small lock of her own dark hair tied with a piece of sinew. It was her way of giving him the spiritual place in the world that he had been denied, of honoring his fleeting life. Nate, meanwhile, was haunted. Sleep offered no escape, only a recurring nightmare that threw him back into the churning, muddy water of the flash flood. In the dream, he would be reaching for the tiny, bundled body of his son, but his fingers would always close on empty air. The child slipping through his grasp into the dark water. He would wake with a choked cry, his body drenched in a cold sweat. His grief, unlike Nalen's quiet mourning, was curdling into something hard and sharp. He found himself consumed by a burning desire for a different kind of justice, not one that came from a court or a lawman, but one that was delivered by his own hands. He wanted the men who had started this chain of events, the men whose greed and cruelty had murdered Nalen's family and set them on this path of ruin. To pay, the thought of vengeance began to take root in his mind, not as a hot-blooded rage, but as a cold, hard necessity. It felt like the only way to balance the scales of their suffering. Their precarious peace was shattered on a clear, cold afternoon. Nate was on a high ridge overlooking the valley that led to their canyon, checking a snare line. He saw the dust cloud first, a faint plume miles away. He watched, his gut tightening, as it grew closer, resolving into a party of riders, a dozen men, as they rode into the valley below. The sun glinted off their rifles. The man in the lead was tall and rode with a cruel, confident slump. Nate's blood ran cold. It was Silas Kane. He scrambled back to the cabin, his limp more pronounced in his haste. He found Nalin outside, scraping a hide. "They are here," he said, his voice low and tight. Together, from a concealed position high on the canyon wall, they watched Kane's party make camp in the valley below. The group had grown. They were no longer just a ragged band of bounty hunters. They looked more organized, better equipped. They were working as Indian hunters, under a semi-official contract from the local mining interests, paid a handsome sum to clear the territory of any remaining Apache presence. They set up their camp with an air of permanence. They were not just passing through. They intended to stay. Seeing them there, so confident and brutal, laughing and spitting around their campfire, reopened the raw wound of Nalin's family's murder. It was a visceral, traumatic experience. The fear was there, a cold knot in her stomach, but this time it was mixed with something else, a cold, clear, and absolute hatred. She looked at the men below not as an overwhelming force to be fled, but as a poison that had seeped into the land, a sickness that must be purged. That night, a fierce, whispered debate took place between them in the darkness of the cabin. Nate's instinct, born of his desperate need to protect her, was to run, to pack their meager belongings and disappear again into the vastness of the wilderness. He argued that confronting Kane and his men was a suicide mission. They were outnumbered, outgunned. It was a fight they could not win. Nalin, however, was unmovable. Her grief had been transformed, hammered into the hard, sharp steel of a warrior's resolve. She would not run anymore. "If we run, they will hunt us," she said, her voice low and intense, devoid of any fear. "And if not these men, then others like them. There is no place for us to run to. They are a storm that will always find us." She looked at Nate, her dark eyes catching the faint firelight. "We do not run from the storm. We find shelter, or we die. This canyon, this is our shelter." She had spent the last weeks exploring every inch of their box canyon, learning its secrets. She knew the game trails, the hidden caves, the places where a single man could hold off 10. "Here, we can fight," she said. "We will honor my family. We will honor our son. We will fight." Her strength, her certainty, swayed him. He looked at her, at the fire burning in her eyes, and he saw the quiet, resilient woman he had fallen in love with. But he also saw someone new, someone forged in the crucible of unimaginable loss, a force of nature in her own right. And he realized she was right. Running was just a slower way to die. Their survival, their very existence, now demanded that they turn and face the storm. Their survival demanded that they become the hunters. They began to plan. The days that followed were filled with a tense, methodical preparation for battle. The narrative of their lives had flipped. They were no longer the prey. Nalin, with her intimate knowledge of the terrain, became the strategist. Her mind was sharp and clear, seeing the landscape not as a place to hide, but as a weapon to be wielded. She knew where a rock slide could be triggered, where a narrow pass created a natural bottleneck, where the echoes played tricks on the ear. Nate, with his military experience, became the tactician. He knew how to set an ambush. He knew the principles of guerrilla warfare. He knew how to anticipate his enemy's movements. He even found a small amount of blasting powder left behind in a rusted can by the miners, a tool he knew how to use to devastating effect. They worked together seamlessly, their shared mission giving them a renewed, if grim, sense of purpose. They were no longer just victims of fate, helpless figures buffeted by the whims of a cruel world. They were agents of their own justice. This shift was psychologically crucial. It empowered them, pulling them out of the depths of their grief and focusing all their pain, all their rage, into a sharp, deadly point. They began their campaign not with a bang, but with a whisper. They engaged in a campaign of psychological warfare, a war of attrition designed to fray the nerves of their enemies. They used the wilderness as their accomplice. One night, they triggered a small rock slide that blocked a key canyon pass. forcing Kane's men to take a long, arduous detour. Another night, Nate crept into their camp like a ghost and stole a side of bacon and a box of ammunition, leaving behind an unsettling sign. A single, black feathered arrow standing upright in a sack of flour. They set clever, non-lethal snares that disabled 2 of their horses, forcing the men to travel on foot through the punishing terrain. Naylin used her knowledge of animal calls to create phantom noises in the night, the perfect imitation of a mountain lion's scream, seemingly just outside the firelight, or the low, unnerving hoot of an owl that seemed to follow them wherever they went. It made the men feel like they were being constantly watched, surrounded. It turned their own prejudice, their deep-seated fear of the savage wilderness, against them. The bounty hunters, who were so confident in their own brutality, became jumpy and paranoid. They started arguing amongst themselves, their greed and cruelty no match for the silent, patient, and intelligent opposition they now faced. The tension built to a direct confrontation. One of Kane's men, a young, nervous-looking man, was scouting alone, trying to find the source of their troubles. He stumbled upon the trail that led to their cabin. Before he could even raise his rifle, Nate was on him, the cold muzzle of his own Winchester pressed against the man's temple. This was the crucial moment for Nate. He had the man at his mercy. The man was terrified, babbling, begging for his life. To pull the trigger, to kill him in cold blood, would be to become the very thing he had hated since the war, the very thing he saw in Silas Kane. Naylin watched from the shadows of the trees, her face unreadable. Nate made his choice. He bound the man's hands and took his weapons. "I am going to let you go," Nate said, his voice low and steady. "You will go back to your boss, and you will give him a message. Leave this land. Take your men and never return. If you do not, you will all die here." He cut the man's bonds. "Now go." The man scrambled to his feet and ran, stumbling down the trail as if the devil himself were at his heels. Nate's act was not one of weakness, but of profound strength. It was him drawing a line in the sand for his own soul. He would fight to protect his wife, their life, their home, but he would not become a murderer. From the trees, Naylin emerged. She looked at him, and he saw in her eyes not a question, but a deep and complete understanding. She nodded once, a sign of her approval. Their justice would not be the same as their enemy's butchery. Kane, however, was not a man to be intimidated. When his scout returned with the story, he was enraged and humiliated. That a single limping white man and an Apache woman were making fools of him was an insult he could not bear. He was no longer hunting for bounty. This was now personal. He rallied his remaining men, their fear now overshadowed by his own fury, for a final, direct assault on the box canyon where he now knew his tormentors were hiding. The inevitable confrontation was looming. As dusk settled, Nate and Naylin stood together on a high ledge overlooking the entrance to their canyon. They had prepared their defenses. They had planned their lines of fire and their routes of retreat. Below them, in the gathering dark, they could see the flicker of Kane's campfires as his men prepared for the morning's attack. They were outgunned and outnumbered, a man with a limp and a grieving woman against a dozen hardened killers. The sky was darkening, a storm brewing on the western horizon, the clouds the color of a fresh bruise, mirroring the coming violence. Nate looked at Naylin. She met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw no fear, only a grim, unwavering acceptance. He reached out and took her hand. It was not a gesture of reassurance, but of solidarity. They had made their stand. Whatever happened at sunrise, they would face it together. This was no longer a fight for their lives. It was a battle for their right to exist. A final, desperate act to claim a piece of the world for themselves. The final confrontation began at dawn. The sky overhead was the color of a day-old bruise, a bruised, mottled purple that threatened a rain that had not yet come. The air in the canyon was still and heavy, thick with anticipation. Silas Kane and his remaining 8 men rode into the narrow mouth of the box canyon with the palpable arrogance of predators who believe they have their prey cornered. To them, this was the end of a frustrating hunt, and the man and woman hiding in the rocks were an easy kill, a final paycheck. They did not know that the canyon itself had been turned into their tomb. From their vantage point, high on the canyon wall, hidden in a deep cleft of rock, Nate and Nolan watched the riders advance in a tight, confident formation. The moment was upon them. Nate gave Nolan a slight nod. She moved to a massive, precariously balanced boulder at the edge of the cliff, a keystone in the deadfall they had spent days preparing. With a deep grunt of effort, she put her shoulder to it and shoved. The great rock teetered for a heart-stopping second and then plunged downward. It struck the slope below, triggering the avalanche they had planned. A cascade of rock and scree, a thundering, grinding river of stone, poured down the steep canyon wall. It crashed onto the canyon floor with a deafening roar that echoed like a cannon shot. A definitive declaration of war. A thick cloud of dust billowed up, and when it cleared, the entrance to the canyon was completely sealed by a massive, impassable barrier of rubble. They were trapped. Panic, immediate and raw, erupted among the bounty hunters as the full weight of their situation crashed down upon them. The battle that followed was not a conventional firefight. It was a series of calculated, deadly engagements, a symphony of chaos orchestrated by 2 desperate people. Nate used his Winchester rifle with the devastating precision he had learned in the war. He did not fire indiscriminately. He aimed to cripple, to confuse, to sow terror. He targeted the most aggressive shooters, the men who tried to rally the others. A shot from his rifle would crack through the air from one direction, and a man would go down, clutching a shattered shoulder. Before the others could react, another shot would echo from a different part of the canyon, and a horse would scream and fall. The unnerving echoes made it impossible for the men below to pinpoint his exact location. They fired wildly into the rocks, their bullets ricocheting with useless, whining shrieks. While Nate pinned them down, Naylin became a spirit of the canyon. She moved with a silent, fluid grace that made her seem to be everywhere at once. She used her knowledge of the terrain to create diversions, a fleeting shadow that drew their panicked fire and deepened their paranoia. From a hidden ledge, she would roll boulders down onto them, not large enough to kill, but big enough to scatter them and break their formations. She sent a few precious arrows, their tips wrapped in pitch-soaked rags, and set aflame, arcing into their supplies, setting a bedroll and a pack mule's load ablaze. And she used her voice, the haunting, mournful cry of a cougar, the sharp, startling bark of a fox, sounds that made the men's blood run cold, making them believe they were surrounded by a much larger force, hunted by the very land they had come to plunder. The bounty hunters, a group of men united only by greed and a shared capacity for cruelty, quickly crumbled under the relentless, invisible pressure. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by a primal, sweating fear. They were hunters, not soldiers, and they did not know how to fight an enemy they could not see. Old resentments and suspicions flared in the crucible of their terror. Kane struggled to maintain control, screaming orders that were lost in the echoing gunshots and the unnerving silence that followed. His authority, built on fear and reward, was eroded with every one of Nate's well-aimed shots, with every inexplicable event orchestrated by Nolan. The hunters began to turn on each other. Some wanted to abandon their horses and try to scramble over the rock slide. Others accused them of cowardice. The battle became as much an internal collapse of their ragged group as it was an assault from above. Their own dark, selfish natures were their ultimate undoing, shattering them against the unified, purpose-driven force of Nate and Naylin's love and will to survive. Despite their success, they were not invincible. In a wild volley of fire, a lucky shot from one of the hunters ricocheted off the rock face near Nate, sending a hot shard of lead into his side. He cried out, the pain a sharp, searing fire. The wound was a deep graze, bleeding freely, but it was not life-threatening. Still, the injury was a stark reminder of how precarious their situation was. How close to death they hovered. The true climax arrived as Silas Cain, a man driven by a venomous, all-consuming pride, finally pinpointed their primary position. Enraged, his face a mask of hateful fury, he made a desperate move. He abandoned his terrified, disorganized men to their fate and began to climb the treacherous rock face towards them, finding handholds and footholds with a reckless, animalistic agility. The confrontation, which had been a battle for the canyon, now became intensely personal. He crested the ledge where Nate was taking cover, a wild, triumphant snarl on his face. The fight devolved into a brutal, close-quarters struggle on the narrow shelf of rock. Nate, hampered by his bad leg and the fresh, burning wound in his side, was at a severe disadvantage. Cain was stronger, a bigger man fueled by a pure, murderous rage. He slammed Nate against the rock wall, and Nate's rifle clattered from his grasp, skittering over the edge of the cliff. The two men grappled, their grunts of effort lost in the whistling wind, dangerously close to the sheer drop. Cain's strength was winning out. He forced Nate to his back, one powerful hand on his throat, the other raising a long, skinning knife. Just as Cain was about to drive the knife home, Naylin appeared. She had been on a lower ledge, preparing another rockfall, but hearing the struggle above, she had scaled the last section of the rock face with a breathtaking, desperate speed. She did not hesitate. She did not scream. With all the strength in her body, all the grief for her family, all the love for her husband, she drove her own knife into Silas Cain's back, just below the ribs. The look of surprise and sheer agony on Cain's face was stark. The snarl of victory turned into a choked grunt. He stumbled backward, his grip on Nate releasing. His eyes, wide with disbelief, locked on Naylin's for a final, uncomprehending moment. He teetered on the edge of the ledge, his arms windmilling in the empty air. And then he was gone, plummeting into the canyon below. His death was a shocking, sudden end to the battle. Below, the few remaining bounty hunters who were still able to fight saw their leader fall. It broke what was left of their nerve. They scrambled in a mad panic, abandoning their weapons, clawing their way over the treacherous rock slide at the canyon's entrance, and fleeing into the wilderness like the vermin they were. Silence, absolute and profound, descended upon the canyon. It was broken only by the whistling of the wind and the first, soft drops of the promised rain. Nate and Naylin were left standing on the ledge, breathing heavily, their bodies bruised, their clothes torn, covered in dust and blood. They were alive. They had won. But the victory was not triumphant. It was somber and utterly exhausting. Nate pushed himself to his feet, clutching his wounded side. He went to Naylin, and they held each other, not in celebration, but for support. Two weary survivors surveying the wreckage of the battle below. The cost had been immense. In order to live, they had been forced to kill. This act, as necessary as it was, left a new and terrible scar on their souls. They were safe from their pursuers, but they were not truly free from the violence that had defined their lives. In the aftermath, as the rain began to fall in earnest, a surprising arrival changed their fate. A small group of Apaches appeared at the now clear mouth of the canyon. Nate's hand went to his pistol, but Naylin stopped him. This was not Cale's war party. It was a smaller, more moderate band, and at their head was an old chief whose weathered face was a map of wisdom and sorrow. He was a man who had known Naylin's father. They had not been seeking Nate and Naylin. They had been tracking Cale, worried that his path of vengeance was leading him and his warriors to ruin. They had heard the tales that were beginning to circulate through the territory. Tales of a ghost-faced warrior and an Apache woman who haunted the Tonto Basin like spirits of vengeance. They had witnessed the end of the fight from a distance. The old chief approached them slowly, his hand raised in a sign of peace. He had seen Naylin's fierce bravery. He had seen Nate's honor in the fight. He did not see a traitor and a ghost face. He saw two powerful warriors who had defended their home against evil men. In a moment of unexpected grace and quiet justice, the chief offered them sanctuary. He told Nalin that while her brother's law, born of pain and anger, had cast her out, the older law of survival and honor had brought her back. He could not offer her a place back in the main Chiricahua tribe. The wounds were too deep, the divisions too great. But he could offer them a protected valley, a place his own people considered sacred, a place where they could live, and where his warriors would watch over them from a distance and leave them in peace. It was not a full reconciliation. It was not a return to the world she had lost, but it was a glimmer of hope. It was an acknowledgement of their right to exist. Several years later, the secluded valley the old chief had given them was a sanctuary. The landscape was no longer a harsh antagonist, but a place of profound healing. The sharp edges of the world had been softened by time and peace. They had built a small, permanent home near a clear, cold stream, a solid cabin of pine and stone. They had a small garden where they grew corn and squash, and a pen with a few goats that provided milk and cheese. The world of men, both white and Apache, largely left them alone. Nate's limp was a permanent part of him now, a reminder of all they had endured. The emotional scars, too, remained, faded but not gone. They never had another child. The memory of their lost son was a sacred, unspoken presence in their lives, a quiet sorrow that they carried together. Their love was no longer the passionate, desperate fire of their youth. It had deepened and mellowed into a quiet river of companionship, of absolute trust, and of shared memory. They were still outsiders, a tribe of two in a world that had no name for them, but they had found a home, not just in the peaceful valley, but in each other. The final scene of their story was a quiet one. They sat on a bench outside their home as dusk settled, the sky turning a deep, velvety indigo. The first stars were beginning to appear. Nalin pointed to a constellation just above the dark silhouette of the mountains. "That one," she said softly, her voice the sound of home. "My people call it the Great Hunter." Nate listened, then reached out and took her hand. His was calloused and scarred. Hers was small and strong. There were no grand declarations, no need for words. There was only a profound sense of peace, hard-won and bittersweet. They had survived. Their love, born in tragedy and forged in the fires of prejudice and violence, had endured. It had not conquered the world or changed its brutal nature, but it had, against all odds, created a small, sacred space where two people could live and heal and be at peace. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.